Congress should support it. The only thing that Smith didn't tell us was that he was a business partner of Morse, and that in fact he put up the money from Congress basically to fund his own company, and he had a huge number of shares which were then paid back to him treblefold at least. So the grand declamations, or if we look at the statue that was erected in New York to great public acclaim and the Times raving about it, it was actually put up with Western Union money, and it was put up in part because Western Union at the time was coming under monopoly investigation for its business practices, and it thought that the best way to distract from it was to say, no, we're simply the heirs to this great and single inventor. So once we start to look at these things closely, they worry us a little, and in fact, one of the most intriguing bits of testimony comes from somebody who worked with Morse through this period. He was the assistant to Vail, and he was bitter in some ways, but he said it's singular that a series of mechanical and scientific failures has given a man such a name and so proud a place in the country. Those who worked with him actually thought it was a klutz. He was a very adept businessman, he wasn't very good scientifically. And we ought to throw in the fact that there's a huge amount of prior work that goes there that asks our question about Morse as the great inventor. Gauss, who many of you will have heard of, the great electrician, the great working with magnetism, in fact had a working telegraph in Göttingen in 1833. Long before Morse. And in fact, Morse, you remember, was in Europe, and he heard about it, we'll see about all these things. Schilling, Pavel Schilling, again, had a telegraph in the Russian Admiralty that ran through the building and worked perfectly well. And Cook and Wheatstone in England, in fact, had a perfectly good working telegraph along the Great Western Railroad long before the telegraph was put up to Baltimore. So there was precedent all along the way. And indeed, there was precedent in the United States. There's the interesting figure of Dyer, who had a telegraph on Long Island, which he was forced to abandon when threatened with prosecution for circulating information in advance of the mail. So the post office tried to put him out of business. His was a flag signaling system. I think it's Dyer who designed the stripes in the American flag. They didn't like his design for the stars, but they did like, I think that's Dyer. More interesting in many ways, the scientist, the new scientist Henry, who did a great deal of electrical work. And thinking back to last week, he was really the pioneer in this area, but he didn't believe in the patent system. He, as we talked about last week, was someone who thought these ideas for the sake of science should be free and should circulate openly, and that everyone should have access to them. And in fact, after Morse got his patent, he was outraged, because he said, look, that stuff, much of that is stuff that I invented and deliberately tried to keep open, and now it's been brought in and controlled by Morse. Now, these are not only people who are disgruntled about Morse talking about him. In fact, in his letters to Congress, Morse himself acknowledges most of these. He talks about Gauss and Göttingen, he talks about the Manchester railway system, he talks about England, Germany, and France, and by 42, he's talking about all the ones that are available across Europe, and he knows they're there. And he says all he's trying to do is establish this improved system, which is fair and honest and perfectly reasonable, but of course Ellsworth gives him a patent as if to say nobody had ever done anything like this before, and this is entirely new. So, looking back to last class and talking about intellectual property, many of the problems are starting to establish themselves as we look at this. In fact, as Richard John says, if you look at most of the stuff that's involved in the telegraph, it had nearly all got precedent, an important precedent elsewhere, both in Europe and the United States. And that might take your mind back to when we talk about Gutenberg. And if you actually look at Gutenberg, the things that Gutenberg invented start to just fade before your eyes and disappear, because again, they all have precedence. So it's almost as if we're looking more in this at a tendency in ourselves to create individual heroes than a technological history of how inventions are procured. But we need to ask, though, what did Morse do? And there are probably three things that we should think about. One is that he introduced the binary code. And as I said, the telephone in some ways was a step back, because this was a binary system of long and short signals, zeros and ones, ons and offs. What we all depend on today was this binary system. In fact, the evidence is probably that most of the system was developed by Vail, who worked with him. They met at New York University. Vail was this young enthusiast. He heard Morse speak and went to work for him. And I did mention this before, that Vail got his idea for the Morse code alphabet by looking at that strange thing up there. Anyone remember what that is on the top right-hand corner? You've all seen it. Has been on the slide. And you've got a big hint from a slide I showed you about 3 slides ago of what I'm talking about. Yes? Yeah, exactly. It's the type case where you hold letters from the printing press. And over time, I've obviously learned to build that so that the most important letters were both in the biggest tray and closest to you. So if you see it up there, start to see that the biggest tray, although it looks like a C, is actually an E, because E is the most commonly used letter, and if you look at Morse's code, the shortest and most easy to produce is the dot, and that's the E as well. So Vail went and looked at New Jersey typecases, said, look, let's see if we can do a dot and dash representation of that. So it's probably fair to say that it's Vail's code, but there's some dispute of that. The first message he sent, he got his father, who actually was an industrialist, to give them room to work in and some money to fund the research. And the first message that was sent, again, another very famous epic message, is, a patient waiter is no loser. Anyone want to guess why that was a cunning message? So he did it in front of his father. He said, look, I'm going to show you this does work, all that money you've invested, and he sent this message. Anyone thought what his father might have been worried about? Yes? Indeed, his father said, look, I've given you all this money, and all you tell me to do is wait, and nothing ever happens. So the first message he sent was kind of exactly right, a reflection of that. He said, oh, the patient waiter is no loser. And indeed, the guy made a lot of money out of it. So Vail and Morse, too, deserve a lot of credit for that, because the English system, the Wheatstone system, was much more clumsy, and it looked like a combination of Schaap's system and Morse. That is, I meant to stop over there, it had a big sort of chart with needles on it, and the needles would point to different letters as you sent different signals across. So this was very important, the binary system. In fact, to be continually unfair, the American Philosophical Society a long time before had discussed such binary systems and how they could be used, borrowing from the French where the idea arrived. He also, which is intriguing in a way when we think of technological progression, he actually reintroduced electrical signaling. The people have been trying to use electrical signaling probably from the 1820s or so, but when Congress asked for submissions for an overland telegraph, and it got, 18 submissions, and 17 of them were still line-of-sight kinds of telegraph. So Morse brought us back to electricity as we got away. So he deserves credit for that. And also, what he did, and thinking back to what I was saying about Cook and Wheatstone, he introduced a simpler system. That the other systems were much more complex. And in modern terms, that's not trivial. We all know the story of Steve Jobs going to Xerox and looking at the first personal computer, the other that had been developed there, and going back and with Xerox's rights developing the Lisa. Well, one of the things he really did, which is most striking if you've seen the two machines, is he just made it a hell of a lot easier to use. And that's not trivial by any means. And it's still into the elegance of Macintosh products. Still, they make the task simple. So, again, I'm not saying that Morse doesn't deserve any credit, but he clearly isn't this single-point inventor that we think about. What Beecham says, and I don't want to go into this because you should have read it, is here we have a technology that in part is made by law. because really both the technology and the industry and the inventor are all in many ways products of the intellectual property system. It's the way that Ellsworth granted that patent as if it was a completely new invention that made Morse seem so significant. Now, Morse had to fight like hell once he'd established it. He suggests that he'd spent $500,000 of 19th century money on law fights, and that money was worth a lot more than it was now. Now, of course, Western Union was earning cartloads of money, so it wasn't quite the problem. You read about Bell and Bell's various cases and saw how extraordinary those were. 18 years. It said they had 600 patent actions and also bought 600 patents in cases where they thought they were going to lose the action. So there were 600 they were able to win and 600 they didn't win, but they took over. Again, you'll read about it, so I'm not going to go too far into it. Bell was also in a race to file that patent. He filed it on Valentine's Day, the Valentine's Day patent. Hours before, the chap who'd been working for Western Electric, Alexei Gray, also was going to file his patent. And there are lots and lots of suspicious accounts of how Bell got his patent in on that day. There is an account that one of the people in the patent office owed a lot of money to one of Hubbard's associates. But many people suggest, though it's not definitive, that word was sent to Bell saying, get your patent in today because this guy Gray is going to file. So there was a lot of skullduggery and dirty work that went on there. And in fact, in Chicago, for years and years later, people said, because Gray came from Chicago, that he was the real inventor and not this wretched, unpleasant Scotsman. And Gray was thought of as the hero in America. But gradually, as the Bell system took over everything. In fact, not only did he have possibly luck, possibly inside job at the patent office, but he also had an extraordinary lucky escape when someone came over, saw his system, and asked if they could take it back to England. And they took it back to England, and Bell, not being a good enough lawyer, hadn't given him an instruction saying, don't use this, because if you use this in England, I can't file my patent. And he hadn't got the patent together early enough to file in England. So the chap went back and he said, I'm going to demonstrate this. I think it's in Scotland. He took it out and he tried to demonstrate it, and the damn thing wouldn't work, and it wouldn't work. And because it wouldn't work, he just put it away, and in the end, Bell was able to come in and file his patent. And the reason it wouldn't work was, in fact, because they'd screwed the telegraph arm down to stop it vibrating as it went across the Atlantic, and they forgot to unscrew it at the other end. So it was simply for want of unscrewing that screw that Bell was able to get patent in England and then in Europe. So extraordinary luck, and this, whether it's luck or duplicity, we don't know. Okay, so again, what I want to say is we need to, and Jeff will talk more about this, get away from our thoughts that are very much with us, of single inventors. Invention in the 19th century, in Jeff's phrase, is more or less invention by committee. And it starts with these ones. It's no longer really easy, though we're always asked to think of single people. Another thing just to run through very quickly is what I called before wishing on technology. We saw those great desires. This machine is going to bring us world peace, intellectual harmony, whatever. Those things are just endemic. But while they're delightful because in many ways they reveal a good side of our character, we want this technology to make the world a better place, they also reveal how naive we can be because we can almost always make exactly the other argument. To run through a few. I mean, one is, whenever a new communications technology along, someone will tell you, and this is going to allow us to fall in love over long distances. And with the telegraph, there were very early on stories of telegraph operators who were men meeting women over the telegraph, and in the first case of someone being married across the telegraph. Now you've seen this probably in MySpace and in Facebook, and always an account. Howard Rheingold tells this story about the Well, and you know that the Well, the first online community over in Marin, you know it's a success because people fall in love and get married over it. It's very heartwarming. In fact, sadly, probably the first reference to the telegraph that I can find in literature in 1795 is this wonderful chap saying, I love the idea of this great new device that will allow me to spy on my wife and get a divorce if she's unfaithful to me. So it isn't only love on the one. And in fact, you know, if you look at Facebook, we discover that people say Facebook nearly destroyed my marriage. So again, when we tell those heartwarming stories, we want to remember the other side of the story. We have this idea that it's open to all, but as I said, Colt, what he really wanted to do was to use this system to create a financial monopoly. That if he could control the signaling system from New York, he would be able to control more or less the whole of the stock market. And that has long precedents. I won't go into all of them, but the nice one of Admiral Cochrane, who saw how a new pigeon carrier network was set up to carry news from the battles on the continent in France. And so he created a mimicked version of it, and this chap rode ashore in Calais and leapt on a horse and carried a message to London, arrived in uniform, looked dirty, and he announced that Napoleon is dead, and the stock market shot up. Well, in fact, Napoleon wasn't dead. It was all complete hooey. But this idea that you can use a communication system to game the system starts very early. Stendhal, even before the telegraph is developed, has a novel called The Telegraph, which is about politicians in France manipulating the stock market because they now control the way in which messages spread. And again, not to go into it, the time is running on, but part of what George is talking about there is, in fact, the crushing power that the telegraph had over all California newspapers. Those who would agree to pay its rates and go along with it would get news. Those who didn't would be crushed. And as he says, not only does that mean that they had to pay their rates, but they also didn't dare criticize any of those corporations, because if they did, they would be cut off and the newspaper would die. So suddenly what you start to see more and more is monopoly of the networks and how powerful that can be. And if you didn't stop and read the George, the wonderful piece on, he's an extraordinary figure, one of the great California figures of all time, and well worth reading on this as on other things. You know, the idea was that this communication would raise the level of public discussion and public debate. So, of course, the earliest reports you get are about queens having children and kings being married, or about criminals being caught. None of it is, in fact, particularly high-minded. What it really feeds is the sensationalist press in an enormously powerful way. What you also get is starts to get concerned. As I say, the military get interested very quickly and get very concerned about what can be on the wire. Jeff again will be talking about the Crimean War as we come up. One of the things that really shook the government was the power of the telegraph. Because in particular, if there were defeats, the whole country would turn against the war. And you wanted to be able to get that news out slowly as a government. And so Clarendon says the press and the telegraph are enemies that we did not take into account. And this is still deep in almost any conflict, the attempts to control the press and not to let them with their faster networks get news back more quickly. Another aspect is that notion of decentralization, which we talked about. Very famously at the Battle of Copenhagen, Nelson, who we say won these battles because of the signal system, is famed for putting his telescope to his blind eye and saying, I see no signal to withdraw. Because in fact what happens with these systems is they centralize power, and you lose your individual control over your ship, over your business, over your county, because all messages now come out from the center. So you start to get people saying, I don't like this because I'm no longer as free as I used to be. Again, you see a different kind of decentralization. In some ways you can say the telegraph made Wall Street. It allowed the financial sector and the heads of corporations to be in one place, and you begin to outsource. Businesses move to New Jersey where they can be contacted by telegraph, and you begin the slow, steady pace of outsourcing around the world with communication networks with power and most of the income remaining in one place. Where we thought it would bring us peace, in fact, it starts to bring war. Very famously, I won't go into it, Bismarck and the Ems telegram managed to bring war, which he wanted, between Germany and France by doctoring a telegram in such a way that what was a perfectly reasonable message from the king starts to look brutal and aggressive and unfriendly. And in fact, the Franco-Prussian War was driven by this. You also get a great deal of power over the cables, cable cutting in times of war. So you would cut off your enemy, and if you happened to be in that little damp island in the North Atlantic where all the cables came through, you had immense power, which, if you occasionally you could either cut off or you could tap. And so America was brought into the First World War by the fact that the British were tapping the German telegraph cables that were going to Mexico. Now, in fact, the Germans were sending their messages across the American wire, And the British had a great dilemma here, because on the one hand they wanted to say, look what this guy is writing, you deserve to come into war, but they didn't want the Americans to know that we were tapping their cable wires at the same time. So they got to do an elaborate dance about how they released the news that they would go to war. And indeed, something to bear in mind over time is what Harold Innis calls the bias of communication. 60 years later, Albert Speer says, these new technologies, the telegraph and the telephone, are the ideal the ideal communication systems of dictatorship. We couldn't have done what we did in Hitler's Germany if we didn't have this new communication system, which everybody had been saying all along is going to bring us peace and light. And then the final irony is this great market intervention creates lots and lots of new companies, becomes the biggest monopolies of all time. Western Union first becomes a stunning monopoly, but as I said at the very beginning, more marked indeed is Bell's company. Bell's company becomes just the monopoly across America until it's finally broken up in 1982, and everyone says at last we'll have competition, and what happens? Well, all the baby Bells slowly amalgamate back into one another, and if it hadn't been for government intervention, they would have been entirely reunited under AT&T once more. So the idea, what we saw back with Bell and his shenanigans goes through, and we're very nearly, in 2011, we could have had the whole thing reassembled once more. So finally then, caution about looking just at technologies and inventors to try to understand history. There are a lot more complex issues involved. There is homework coming up. We're going to go on to talk about technologies of the image. So we'll be talking about photographs and other new technology. In fact, Daguerre patents the same year that Morse patents. And there's an assignment. Jeff, do you need to say anything about it?
No. The Suntech continuing essay, we've got interesting essay in 21. And it's a straightforward history of history. And we'll be talking about stuff.
Okay, so we'll post this. It's about reading the two essays, some images you have to look at. We'll post it due to be in on Sunday. Thanks very much.